In this session, I'll try to pick up a little bit from where I left off when I was concerned about the differential drive shaft front nut being too tight, but that wasn't an issue. And I want to show the rest of the condition of the rest of the bearings, but I'll leave that to last. I want to cover the bearing and bearing cup removal procedures that I followed, and last and first of issue before I start moving parts around, want to cover the power flow, particularly to point out an issue for the reverse idler and transmission drive shaft lube system in this primitive transmission, so that you pay attention to that if you're into the transmission. So first gear, engaging here for first, driving the differential drive shaft, nothing special about that. And second to second, again, nothing special there. In third gear, this shifter is moved forward onto this collar, and this differential drive shaft third gear pinion is in constant mesh with the gear on the transmission drive shaft. It's usually an idler gear. So in third, then coupled up here to the higher speed going through the differential drive shaft. For reverse, the reverse idler pinion isn't lying down between the two shafts like this. It's actually up high in the transmission, mounted on that shaft. And I want to show something again about the lube system in there. It's in constant mesh with the differential drive, with the transmission drive shaft. And to reverse, move this this first pinion rearward to engage it. And again, it's sitting up high. So remember, I said the reverse pinion is in constant mesh with the transmission drive shaft. So if it's sitting up high, how does it get lubricated? We mentioned earlier the hole that's in the pinion shaft, and I'm going to take that out of there in a bit to show you something about it. So if it was, the tractor was sitting still, running something on the belt like a corn sheller or something, what happens to these parts that are idling up out of the oil level? Well, remember the third gear here is idling on the differential drive shaft and picked up by the shifter on the collar here. So the transmission drive shaft turning clockwise, differential drive shaft idler here turning counterclockwise, and so it's throwing oil, it's down in the oil, throwing up oil on the left wall of the transmission case. So now, forgive the steadiness of my hand here, on the top left wall of the transmission case, as shown, if I can steady it and you can show it by this pointer, there's a trough on the left wall, and it comes far enough forward that that idler gear is moving oil and throwing oil up into this trough all the time. So if you're ever in the transmission, you want to clean out all the corruption, that's sludge that's in the bottom of this trough. And the front bore on that trough is for the idler shaft of the reverse idler, and that set screw is holding the shaft in place. But the shaft, if I come back to it, the shaft is cross-drilled where the set screw goes. Remember that trough? Oil can enter the front of the shaft in this bore here, and so it's lubricating the idler, which is sitting at this area here, and then the oil flows rearward to this cross-drilled hole, which is on one side where the set screw is holding the idler in place, and then by the gravity, no oil pump in this situation, if I take the set screw out of the transmission, there is a cross hole in the transmission case. If I use this tie band with any success, there is the passageway through the back of the idler shaft into the valley in the area with a little retainer wall there. There's a valley behind the rear cup of the transmission drive shaft. So oil thrown by the third gear idler up into the trough here, flows by gravity to the reverse pinion, lubricates the pinion, flows by gravity to the cross-drilled hole, and across to the cup at the back of the transmission drive shaft, if everything is clean. So need to clean the trough and need to clean those passages in the idler. And of course I found sludge in both tractors in that area. So maybe that's why my transmission drive shaft rear bearing was in the condition that we talked about earlier. See if I can focus it closer. Transmission drive shaft rear bearing was pitted or corroded, spalled, whatever you want to say, and I know those aren't necessarily the same. And the cup wasn't in good shape either. So that was the source of my rear of the transmission drive shaft noise. The front bearing on the transmission drive shaft was not as bad, but also has corrosion on it. And in the cup, corroded what I presume was the, well, I shouldn't presume, I think I saw it, that the bottom of the cup where the gravity and water would collect, the bottom of the transmission drive shaft front bearing cup is corroded. The differential drive shaft rear bearing has the shims for the cone point setting, and I'll come back to that. The bearing is also corroded, not as bad as the transmission drive shaft because of this, of course, is in oil. The cup has some corrosion. This one wasn't particularly bad. The differential drive shaft front bearing, again the same part number and same small bearing, even though it's down in the oil area, also had corrosion. Whether the preload of the differential drive shaft had anything to do with accelerated wear or issues here. And its cup is showing signs of corrosion as well. Again, this one, you can feel some gritty movement there. The differential bearings were similarly corroded, and I've got this puller on here to show that, so I'm not actually showing, but similar corrosion to the better bearings. It wasn't being particularly noisy, but you could hear a little bit of growl on the floor, on the table. Not as bad as the two small bearings by any means. So now I want to talk about some removal and replacement procedures. I'm going to put this back to automatic. Hopefully that'll work. The differential bearings are the worst ones to deal with for removal. I went for this brand name puller set here, but I found that it isn't adequate to do the job, and that's why you see a little significant help on there. This one I was able to get loose cold. On my other tractor, the legs had pinched off the shims on the side, and I heated the bearings with my small welding torch. Whether that did any real good or not with the thin walls in there, I don't know, but I got them off. This time I decided to give this cross screw in here's really too high to be effective with the. As I was saying before it timed out, the cross screw is too high and the legs flex too much under the pressure given the small surface area the end of the leg has in this differential. And of course, if you had it perfectly vertical and everything was perfectly square, it might not be an issue. But I find that one side tends to roll, and whether if I'd stopped then and tried to adjust the cross screw to pull the other way and keep it square, that might have worked, but I gave up on that, having damaged both shims on both sides with various trials. So with the chain vice grip, it's held it securely enough that I was able to get some torque on the forcing screw and get the bearing to move cold. So that's more successful than anything I'd tried previously, for your consideration. Move on now to other issues for bearing removal and condition in the transmission. The shim pack is a bit larger ID than the rear race, so when hammering out the differential drive shaft cup, it is a good idea to pay attention to where the shims are and try to avoid smashing them. Taking the differential drive shaft front cup out is not an issue with a long punch. The transmission drive shaft front bearing is in this front quill again, and once the seal is out, then it's possible to get at the back of it and drive it out, so that's not a particular problem. The transmission drive shaft rear bearing has full contact with this surface area. On the two shafts, this is the most challenging one to deal with. On my 12-ton press, took the full second handle and some pressure before that one popped loose. The front transmission drive shaft bearing's larger and sits on spline surface, so it's not difficult to remove. The differential drive shaft rear bearing was able to access that and use it in the press. Wasn't too surprising or complicated. And the differential drive shaft front bearing is a slip fit. I want to point this out here, this spacer on the third gear to sit between the gear, the idler gear, and the front differential drive shaft bearing is important. On my other tractor it wouldn't stay in third gear, and whoever worked on it before me must have had that lying in a wash bucket or somewhere, and it didn't make its way back into the transmission. The big puller here was used behind the bearing of the transmission drive shaft, and that worked okay in the press with it. So I think that covers condition of the bearings, well, the standard type punches are what I use to punch the cups out of the transmission. And as I've said, differential drive shaft, or differential bearings are troublesome with a little space in there. The puller legs go against the shim pack that is on each side, first of all to set the backlash, and then secondly the preload on these bearings, which these bearings are a press fit in the differential housing. So the legs want to shift around on those shims, and the shims in my case have been damaged at that recess, but I'll put the damaged area back in the recess when it goes back together, and I think I'll still have a shim setting that, or a shim pack that I can work with, because I'm not sure they're easily found, although this differential seems to be similar size to Dana differential, so it could be that parts aren't too hard to find in the automotive industry. I wanted to mention on the wisdom of YouTube, I found that removing a 10,000th shim from one side to the other in the differential could reduce backlash by about 7 thousandths. So that's what I intend to do, is move the ring gear 10 thousandths closer to the pinion and hopefully get my backlash closer to where it is. This did pry out of the transmission. Wasn't as difficult as my other tractor, but it was under preload, so I don't intend to change the overall shim pack. I think that covers it for this part.